Hi, everyone. Welcome back. This recording will begin our final chapter before the midterm. So we'll be taking a little bit of time to talk about the labor market equilibrium. So that'll be combining both the labor supply and the labor demand that we talked about in the previous two chapters. Now, as someone who works in human resources, you will both be representing the firm and be a worker yourself. So this should help give you insight into both sides of the labor market. So let's think about this from your perspective as a worker. Your goal at work is to receive as high of a wage as possible, something that typically we try to maximize. On the other hand, the firm wants to pay as low of a wage as possible. So this creates a disconnect where firms and workers have opposing desires. But while many firms would prefer to pay low wages and many workers would prefer to receive higher wages, firms are willing to pay more and workers are willing to accept less than their absolute goals. We'll see how the interaction between firms and workers in the labor market help reach an equilibrium, where the quantity of workers that are employed and the quantity of workers sought by firms are the same. Adam Smith likened the process to an invisible hand, where it was as if someone was directing the market. However, there isn't one individual doing that or a small group of people. It occurs naturally through individuals and their interactions with each other. Each market participant, firms and workers, both sides, act in their own self-interest, taking the best deal available to them. But it results in a situation that appears as if it was designed by a single person who sought to maximize efficiency. This assumption of the efficiency is what directs government labor market interventions, because we say that equilibrium is the most efficient situation possible in the labor market. When there's times that it doesn't quite reach that, or it's not quite as perfect or quite as efficient as it should be, government regulations try to move it in a better direction. Later in this chapter, we'll talk about two extreme cases, monopsony and monopoly. You're likely familiar with monopoly, where there's only one seller. That's the goal of the board game, after all. Monopsony is the exact opposite example. So in a monopsony, there's only one buyer of a good or a service. These market structures will lead to two unique equilibria conditions. But we're going to begin with the standard competitive labor market and then branch out from there. So I briefly showed you the competitive labor market equilibrium at the end of last chapter. Now we're going to dig into it more. So first, a competitive labor market has many buyers and sellers. There are enough firms that they are not able to effectively set the price. If a firm tries to offer too low of a wage, workers will choose to go elsewhere. Likewise, workers do not have the kind of market power where they can command their own salaries. We can obviously think of some cases where this happens. So things like CEOs or pro athletes, where they are so talented, there's so few people out there that can do what they do, that they can command their own wages. But in general, workers have to take what's offered to them. In a competitive labor market, equilibrium occurs when the number of workers willing to work at a certain wage equals the number of jobs employers are offering at that wage. This balance sets the wage level and the total number of jobs. At this point, there's no shortages and no surpluses in the labor market. So you don't have workers that want to work that are sitting out of a job at that wage. And you don't have a bunch of firms that want to hire people, all these open positions that they can't find workers for at that wage. However, it's important to remember, like we talked about in chapter 1, that labor markets are constantly changing. New jobs open up, workers gain new skills, some retire, some switch industries entirely. So while equilibrium gives us a sense of balance, in reality, the labor market is always moving towards that balance, but rarely stays there. While it may not exactly be in equilibrium or be there very long, the market is always moving towards equilibrium. So this is an incredibly valuable model. And one of the reasons I try to highlight that we're constantly being knocked out of equilibrium or moving towards equilibrium is because I don't want you to look at the labor force or from hiring within your own company and to think, wow, this really does not match what I see. This model doesn't encapsulate the real world very well. So I want to highlight that this is not the state that we're constantly in, but it's what we're moving towards. Now, my wife likes Hallmark movies, so I've been watching a bunch of them lately. So let's think of a small town with a cute bakery run by the protagonists of one of these movies. Let's say they need 10 workers and they're willing to pay $15 an hour as their wage. If there are exactly 10 people who want to work for that $15, the market is in equilibrium. There are as many workers willing to work at that wage as there are job openings that the firm is willing to pay or hire the worker and pay them that wage. But let's suppose suddenly 5 more people want jobs. Well, now the bakery might lower wages since more workers are available to work those jobs. And because there are more people, trying to find those jobs, trying to find a job, they'll be willing to take lower wages in order to get one. On the other hand, let's say 2 workers get married and they leave town. Now there's only 8 people there who want to work. The firm may need to increase the wage to attract more employees if they still want to hire 10 employees. So this figure here illustrates the labor market equilibrium. An equilibrium wage in employment is determined by the intersection of the supply and demand curves. So this point right here. In this case, the equilibrium wage is at this point here, W star, and the level of employment here is at E star. The S curve sloping upwards is the supply curve. This can represent the total number of people working, the total number of hours worked, or the total employee hours in the economy, depending on what we're trying to use the model for. I will typically simply call it the number of employees, again, to keep things simple and straightforward, unless the example specifically calls for something else. The D curve here is the demand curve. Remember, it's downward sloping, and it represents the total number of either people working, number of hours worked, or the total employee hours in the economy that firms are willing to hire. Again, it'll always be the exact same one as the supply curve. Again, in this case, I'll be working with employment or number of employees as much as possible because that's the simplest thing to conceptualize for our examples. When the labor market is in equilibrium, the unemployment rate is 0. This is just basically a definition because in this case, everyone who is willing to work has a job. Everyone who is out of work in this case is choosing not to work. They're leaving labor force. Remember, unemployment rate does not count people who leave the labor force, even though they still exist in the real world. Once the equilibrium wage is established, each firm will hire workers until their wage equals the value of the marginal product of labor. When we add up all the firms together, the employment level is going to equal this E star right here. Now, what happens if the wage of firms are offering is above the equilibrium wage? Say in this case, up here at W prime. Well, at this point, there will be a surplus of workers willing to work at this wage. Looking where the labor demand curve crosses this wage, firms will want to hire EL workers. So at the demand curve here, at that wage, trace that straight down to EL. But that's, if you should notice, less than the equilibrium wage, or equal number of workers, excuse me. But at this higher wage, more workers are going to be willing to work. If we trace this out to the supply curve, we hit the supply curve here, all the way down to EH. So that's how many are willing to work at this higher wage. Once this happens, once firms see that there are a lot more people willing to take these jobs and there are job openings, they can start offering lower wages than this W prime. So start moving down here towards the equilibrium wage. Some workers will begin to accept those offers, while others will leave the labor market entirely because the wages aren't high enough. Over time, more workers will leave and more firms will be willing to hire as wages fall, moving us along the supply and demand curves down to E. So as we drop down from W prime down to W star, as the wage moves down, we'll cross the demand curve lower. So firms will be willing to hire more workers, and we'll move down the supply curve because more workers are now leaving the labor force. Fewer want to work at that wage. Eventually, we'll go down and we'll reach the equilibrium wage and equilibrium, level of employment. At that point, there's no more incentive for firms to reduce wages. If they reduce wages, they'll be willing to hire more workers, but even fewer workers will be able to work, and they'll have all these job openings that they won't be able to fill. The best way to fill those job openings is start offering more money, and that'll bring them right back up to equilibrium if they decided to go too far. Now, this gray shaded area P right here represents the producer surplus when the market is in equilibrium. Going along the demand curve at the highest points, we can see this is the firm willing to hire a worker at this wage. It is high, so they won't hire many, but they'll be willing to pay for that first worker. For that first worker, they'll be willing to pay quite a bit way up here. But as they hire more and more, they'll be willing to pay less and less per worker. Eventually, we'll go down, we'll reach equilibrium here, where the firm is willing to pay the exact wage rate that that worker is receiving. Now, the difference between the wage rate that firms are willing to pay and the wage rate actually paid is called the producer surplus. So this whole area here between the demand curve, what they're willing to pay, and the wage that they're actually paying here is a producer surplus. This can be thought of as the surplus value that firms get from hiring workers at the equilibrium wage. Likewise, this kind of purplish gray area here, Q, below the wage rate and above the supply curve, represents the consumer surplus of the labor market when it's in equilibrium. To understand this, we start by looking at the supply curve. At the highest points along the supply curve, the workers would only be willing to work for a higher wage, so way up here. However, as we move down the supply curve, more workers are willing to accept a lower wage until we reach here the equilibrium wage. At that point, workers are paid exactly what they're willing to work for. The consumer surplus is the difference between what workers are willing to accept and what they actually receive. So for instance, some workers might have been willing to work for a lower wage, so somewhere down here, but they're being paid the prevailing market wage or the equilibrium wage. So the sum of the area between what they're willing to work for and what they're actually being paid represents the surplus. And the values that workers get from receiving more than the minimum that they would accept to work. So imagine a retail store that hires seasonal workers for the holiday season. The retail store needs extra staff for the busy holiday season. So to fill the first position, they're willing to pay, let's say, up to $20 an hour. So this worker is critical. They really need to get that body in the door. However, as they hire more workers, each additional worker is slightly less crucial than the previous one. So let's say the second one, the store is only willing to pay $18 an hour for, all the way down until they reach $15 an hour, which is what they pay all the workers. So the surplus for the firm is the difference between what they would have been willing to pay. So the $20 for the first worker, $18 for the second, so on and so forth, and the $15 that they actually pay. Now, the store is saving some money because it's paying some workers less than they would have been willing to pay for their contribution to the business. Now, let's look at the other side, on the worker side. Let's say the first worker was only willing to work if they could earn $10 per hour. The second would have been willing to work for $12 an hour and so on, up to the equilibrium wage that they're being paid at $15 an hour. For the workers, the difference between what they would have accepted, so the $10 to $12 an hour, and what they're actually being paid is their consumer surplus. This is the extra income above the minimum accepted wage. We call this their surplus, or the gain from working at the equilibrium wage. Now, if either the supply or demand curve for labor changes, this is going to shift the curves and cause the equilibrium wage and employment levels to change. For example, if a new company opens in town and needs more workers, the demand curve shifts to the right. So take this demand curve, and it'll move out to the right and be somewhere over here, crossing the supply curve at a higher point. So although this graph shows a snapshot at equilibrium, like we just took a quick picture, in reality, the labor market is constantly changing and moving as wages and job availability fluctuate. The supply and demand curves shift in response to real-world changes like technological advancement, shifts in consumer demand, and government policies, plenty of other things. Okay, so now let's talk about efficiency in the labor market. So the figure is a similar one from the previous slide that shows the labor market is in equilibrium. We can see how it reaches the optimal level of employment and wage rate and how it maximizes producer and consumer surplus. So the firm's total revenue is the sum of the marginal value of all the workers that they hire, so all the way up to E star. Because the labor demand curve gives the value of the marginal product, the area under the demand curve equals the value of the total product. Because each worker is paid the wage rate and equilibrium, W star, the profits going to the firm is everything above that wage up to the demand curve, or the triangle P. Workers also gain, like I said before. Their gain is equal to the Q triangle, which is the difference between what they were willing to work for and what they're actually paid. In a competitive labor market equilibrium, we say that the outcome is Pareto efficient, because there is no way to make anyone better off without making someone else worse off. Here's what it means in the context of the labor market. An allocation is Pareto efficient if it's impossible to change the allocation to improve one person's situation, either a worker or an employer, so someone on either side of the equation, without hurting another party. In the labor market, this means that at the equilibrium wage, workers who are willing to work at that wage are hired, all of them. And firms that are willing to hire workers at that wage can find employees, again, for every position. In a competitive equilibrium, supply equals demand. Workers are paid the wage that they value their labor at, as represented by the supply curve, and they supply the exact amount of labor that they're willing to work for at that wage. Firms are hiring workers based on the value that they place on that labor, as represented by the demand curve, and they hire exactly the amount of labor that they want at that wage. Because supply equals demand, both parties, workers and firms, are satisfied. If we try to change the situation, let's say by raising wages or lowering wages, some workers who want to work at the new wage wouldn't be able to find a job, or some firms wouldn't be able to hire the amount of labor that they need at that wage. Any attempt to change the allocation would make one side worse off without benefiting the other, meaning that the labor market in equilibrium is Pareto efficient. So let's use that retail store example from before. At the equilibrium wage of $15 per hour, the store hires the exact number of workers that it needs. And the workers who want to work at $15 an hour are hired. If the wage were to increase to $18, the store might decide that they want to hire fewer workers instead. So some of those workers who wanted jobs at $15 an hour, now they're suddenly out of work. They're not going to be hired. They would end up being worse off, even though the other workers who did get a job at $18 an hour, they would end up benefiting at their expense. Now let's say the wage drops to $12. More workers might want jobs at the store, but the store would only be willing to hire a smaller number of workers than before because they need less labor at that wage. So some workers would be left without a job and be worse off. So the equilibrium wage of $15 an hour is in the labor market is Pareto efficient because any deviation would end up harming either workers or the store. Now, up until now, we focused on equilibrium within a single labor market, where supply and demand meet at a specific wage. But in reality, the economy is made up of many interconnected labor markets. So you could think of the market for tech workers or retail employees, markets for healthcare workers, tons of different industries. Now, these labor markets don't exist in isolation. Changes in one can impact the other. For instance, if wages rise in one industry, workers might leave their jobs in other industries to take the now more higher paying jobs. That will cause a shift in the labor supply in both markets. This means that while each labor market might have its own equilibrium across multiple markets requires balancing how workers and firms interact across the economy as a whole. So next, what we're going to do is explore what happens when we look at equilibrium across multiple labor markets and how they influence each other. Now, in an ideal world, if workers can move freely between jobs and there were no barriers to entry or exit in the labor market, all workers would earn the same wage. That's because workers would naturally gravitate towards higher paying job and firms would compete for labor by raising their wages. Eventually, this movement would equalize wages across the economy. The idea here is that when wages equal the value of the marginal product of labor across firms, it results in an efficient allocation of workers in the economy. We call this allocative efficiency because the resources, in this case labor, are being used where they create the most value. So for an example, think of an economy where some firms are very productive while other firms are a lot less productive, a lot less efficient. If workers move to the more productive firms where their labor creates more value, the entire economy ends up benefiting. This allocation maximizes the national income since every worker is employed in the role that contributes the most to overall productivity. The invisible hand refers to the way in which individuals acting in their own self-interest lead to outcomes that benefit society as a whole, without that being anyone's intention. Workers seek higher wages and firms seek higher profits, but these individual actions end up leading to allocative efficiency. No one is deliberately trying to maximize the national income, but through this process of free movement and competition, it ends up happening naturally. So for example, a construction worker moving from a low-paying job to a higher-paying one does not only improve their own situation. By doing that, they also help allocate labor where it's now most productive. The firm hiring the worker is better off because they get more value from the labor, and the worker earns a higher wage. This contributes to overall economic efficiency. We say that in equilibrium, the market will have a single wage for workers. This has important implications. In a competitive labor market, wages equal the value of the marginal cognitive labor. That means that if there are differences in wages between regions for the same type of job or industry, and workers and firms can move between those regions, the invisible hand will eliminate regional wage differences over time. So workers in low-wage regions will receive higher wages over time because that's the marginal value of their production. So eventually, workers in the same field with the same skill level and productivity will have the same wages, even if they start out earning different wages. So let's see an example of this. As a kid, I remember hearing a lot about NAFTA, but I was so young, I didn't really know what it was at the time. But what it did was help break down barriers for trade and employment between the US, Canada, and Mexico, basically allowing freer trade between all three of the countries. Free trade between countries, opening up these markets, kind of expanding them and closer to one market, reduces the wage differences between regions for industries where production is done and goods are sold in both. So if the US and Mexico become like one market for a particular good, that will increase workers' wages in that industry in Mexico because the marginal value of the worker's product increases with the opening of sales in the US. So let's walk through an example of two labor markets linked, but two labor markets that represent different regions. We'll call them North and South for this example. Sorry about that. We'll call them North or South for this example. Let's say the workers in the two regions are exactly the same. They have the same skill level, the same sort of job responsibilities, all of that. However, the wages are higher in the northern region. So that's what's shown here in the figure on the left, the northern region. And then on the right, here we have, well, the southern region. So the wage in equilibrium, WN here for the wage in the north, is higher than it is down here in the south, WS. We'll draw the supply curves as vertical lines in this case. So supply curve in the north, vertical, supply curve in the south here. Because we assume that the supply is perfectly inelastic, so it's not responsive to changes in wages. It makes it easier for us to show movement between countries if we have a vertical supply curve, but we can draw the general upward sloping curve that we're used to and end up with the same results. It's easier this way. So if there are no barriers to migration and firms are able to relocate easily, then this will not persist in the long run, the difference in wages between the two regions. So workers won't stay in a region where wages are lower if they can easily move to another region offering higher wages for the same job. Because, all else being equal, workers prefer to earn more money for their labor. If a similar job is available elsewhere with better pay, workers have an incentive to move to that region since it allows them to increase their income without doing more work. This movement continues until wages across the regions start to equalize because as workers leave the low-wage area, the labor supply curve there shrinks, driving wages up. Conversely, as more workers move into the high-wage area, the increased labor supply there pushes wages down, leading to equilibrium across regions. So here you see this in action. Southern workers move to the northern region, which is two things. First, it increases the supply of workers in the north, shifting the curve from SN to S prime N. So moving from this curve out to here. That pushes the wage down from point A to point B. This corresponds to a lower equilibrium wage, which is shown in the movement from WN to W star. So the wage level right here. The increase in employment here is shown in the shaded blue area. But we also see a reduction of workers in the southern region because workers are leaving. So now it's taking the supply curve for the south and shifting it to the left. In this case, the wages that are being paid to the workers in the southern region will slowly rise as there are fewer workers in the region for firms to hire. Now, this is going to continue until we move up to the W star, the same wage we see in the northern labor market. At that point, there's no more incentive for workers to move from the south to the north because it's not going to increase their wages. Now, the same basic thing would happen if firms chose to move between the two regions instead of the workers themselves. They would either bring workers with them or hire new workers after they move. Now, note in real life, that wages will likely not be exactly equal between regions. It costs money to move, and people don't like moving. Sometimes there's language barriers, there's different culture. One is just a hassle to move. When we consider the cost of moving, including the non-monetary cost, the wages will be equal between the two regions. So it may actually be a little bit higher in the north at the end of this entire process, but the difference in the wages will be captured by the cost of actually moving from one country to another. Sometimes it can be difficult to measure. So like physicists with dark matter, we say it's the difference from what we expect and what we see. Now, the scatter plot shows this in action. It's a comparison of the historical wages in manufacturing, what we see here on the x-axis, the manufacturing wage in 1950, and the annual wage growth today, or a few years, 1992, so several years ago, on the y-axis. So US states are a good example because there are no internal tariffs or trade barriers between states, and people can generally move freely between them. What we see is that states with the lowest wages in the 1950s, so down here on the x-axis, we see the highest wage growth today. And the states where we had the highest wages back in 1950, we see some lower wage growth today. This is evidence that over time, wages will equalize between regions. Let's see, the next slide is payroll taxes. So, we'll break that off and have that as the next lecture. So we'll stop here for the time being.